The coldest morning of the year, a church with a chain on its doors and a red condemned sign nailed where the welcome used to be. And on the bottom step, folded over like something the wind dropped there, a 78-year-old man named Walter Brennan, the same man who had walked through those doors every Sunday for 50 years. How does someone end up here? It's simple, really. You take everything from him slowly, so he won't notice until it's too late. The house he paid off in 1994 gone, signed away while he thought he was signing a hospital form. The savings gone, his own name lifted off every document that ever mattered by the one person on earth he never thought to fear, his own son. And when there was nothing left to take, they drove him to a locked church, opened the car door, and left. No goodbye, no glance in the mirror. The brake lights never even came on. By every measure that counts, Walter Brennan had lost. The papers were signed. The law agreed. The story was over. Except for one thing, they never thought to check his coat and what his late wife had sewn into the lining of it 30 years before she died, one folded page that was about to turn the whole thing upside down. 1 year earlier, Walter Brennan kept a routine you could set a clock by. He was 77 then, a retired pipe fitter with hands that still knew how to fix anything that leaked, hummed, or refused to start. Every morning at 6, he put the kettle on, and while it heated, he wound the brass Mantel clock on the shelf above the stove, the one Eleanor had bought him for their 20th anniversary. It lost 4 minutes a week. He'd given up correcting that. He just gave the key 3 half turns, the way he always had, and listened for the tick to catch. The house on Sycamore Lane was small and square and stubborn, like him. He'd put a new roof on it himself at 68, climbing the ladder while the neighbors watched and shook their heads. He'd buried his wife from it 4 years back. Her reading glasses were still on the windowsill in the kitchen, folded where she'd left them. He dusted around them. He did not move them. Sundays, he walked the 9 blocks to St. Aidan's. Rain, snow, August heat, it didn't matter. Third pew from the front, left side, the seat worn smooth by 50 years of the same man sitting in the same place. Father Reyes used to joke that they should bolt a little plaque to the wood. Walter would say Eleanor had picked that pew because the morning light came through the blue window and landed right on the page of the hymnal, and he wasn't about to argue with a woman who'd been right about everything else. He fixed things for people. That was the habit nobody asked him to keep. The Henderson's furnace, the food pantry's walk-in freezer, the church's ancient boiler, which he'd nursed through 14 winters, climbing down into the basement with a flashlight in his teeth, because no diocese repairman would touch something that old. He kept a key to that basement on his ring. Nobody had ever asked for it back. Nobody remembered he had it. His son Daniel came by on the first Sunday of each month. Lately, he came more often, and lately he brought a laptop and a folder and a soft, patient voice. He talked about Walter's age, about what would happen if something happened, about how complicated the house and the accounts had gotten, and how it might be simpler, easier, safer, if Daniel could just help manage things. Sign here. It's only so I can handle the bills if you're ever in the hospital. Walter signed. His hands had started to shake by then, just slightly, and the doctor had used a word that frightened him, and Daniel was his son. You signed for your son. There was one afternoon he almost noticed. Daniel was on the porch, on the phone, and the screen door was open. And Walter heard him say a name, Garrett Cole, and the word lot, and the number 4.2. Then Daniel saw him through the screen and stepped down into the yard and lowered his voice. And when he came back in, he was smiling and asked if Walter wanted the gutters cleaned before fall. Walter let it go. It was probably nothing. Daniel handled business things now. That was the whole point. He wound the clock that night, 3 half turns, and listened for the tick to catch, and went to bed in the house he still believed was his. It happened on a Tuesday, and March Walter was at the kitchen table with his tea when the knock came, not Daniel's knock, which was 2 quick raps, but something flatter and official. A man in a gray jacket stood on the porch with a clipboard and a manila envelope, and behind him a woman was already photographing the front of the house with her phone. The man asked if he was Walter Brennan. He said he was. The man handed him the envelope and said, "You've been served," and the words made no sense. The way a sentence in another language makes no sense, even when you know every word in it inside, was a notice of eviction and a stack of documents Walter could not read fast enough to understand. But he understood the signatures. He understood the date, a power of attorney, executed 11 months earlier the afternoon Daniel had sat at this very table, with the laptop and the soft voice and the folder. The form Walter had been told was a hospital consent, and he understood the deed of sale, the house on Sycamore Lane, transferred out of his name and into a holding company, signed by Daniel Brennan as attorney-in-fact. Sold. The reading glasses were still on the windowsill. The house was already gone. He called Daniel 11 times that day. On the 12th call, Daniel answered, and his voice was the patient voice, the one for old men and small children. "Dad, we talked about this. You're not safe alone. I had to make decisions. There's a place that can take you. It's better this way." Walter did the only thing he knew to do. He fought. He took the envelope to a legal aid office 2 towns over, sat in a plastic chair for 3 hours, and watched a tired young lawyer read the papers and slowly stop nodding. The power of attorney was notarized. The signature was genuine Walter's own hand. "You signed this," the lawyer said, not unkindly. "Did you read it?" Walter said he'd been told it was for the hospital. The lawyer set the page down. "That's a hard thing to prove," he said. "It's your word against the document, and the document's notarized." He gave Walter the name of someone who might take it on contingency. He did not sound hopeful. Walter called that someone. He called 4 someones. He spent 11 of his last days on the phone, on buses, in waiting rooms, holding the manila envelope like a thing that might still save him if he just found the right person to show it to. Each one read the deed. Each one looked at the genuine signature and the official seal. Each one said some version of the same sentence. "It's airtight. I'm sorry." The eviction came on a gray morning. 2 movers Daniel had hired carried boxes to a storage unit Walter would never see again. A young man from the county stood by the door with the keys. Daniel did not come himself. He sent his wife in the car. She did not get out of the car. She rolled down the window and said, "Get in, Walter. There's a bed for you at the facility." And Walter looked at her and looked at the house, and the brass clock was already boxed somewhere in the back of a truck, and he picked up his paper bag with the 2 shirts, and he did not get in the car. He walked. He walked the 9 blocks he had walked every Sunday of his adult life because his feet did not know anywhere else to go. He walked to St. Aidan's. That the chain was new. The padlock was new. Condemned. In red. The diocese had closed the parish 6 weeks earlier, declining attendance, deferred repairs, the usual quiet language of money, and there was a second sign, smaller, that Walter stood and read 3 times before his legs gave out, pending sale, and a name on the contact line, Garrett Cole Development. He sat down on the bottom step. The car that had followed him idled at the curb a moment, then pulled away. The brake lights never came on. That was where Maria Delgado found him. 2 hours later, slumped sideways with his cheek against the cold stone and the paper bag still in his fist. She was 34, a hospice nurse on her way home from a double shift. And she knew the color of a man's face when something has gone wrong inside him. She had him breathing and talking before the ambulance came. She rode with him. She gave the intake desk what little she knew. His name was Walter. He'd had no ID. The paramedics had cut his coat open to get to his chest, and the coat had been bagged with his things. 2 days later, she came back to the hospital on her day off because no one else had, and because the coat was still in the property bag and it seemed wrong to let a man wake up with no coat. She meant only to bring it to his room, but the hem was wrong. There was a stiffness in the lining near the left side, a small hard rectangle where there should have been nothing but wool. She turned the coat inside out under the fluorescent light of the hospital hallway and found a seam that had been sewn shut by hand small, careful, deliberate stitches, decades old. She worked a thread loose with her thumbnail, then another, and she drew out a single page, folded into quarters, yellow and water-stained and soft as cloth from age. She could not read most of it. The language was legal and dense, and the typewriter ink had faded, but 3 words near the bottom had been circled, hard, in blue ink, by a hand that pressed down the way people do when they need to be remembered. Dot returns to grantor. And stapled behind it, a property tax bill, not addressed to the diocese, not addressed to any church. Estate of Eleanor Brennan. Maria stood very still in the empty hallway, the coat in one hand and the page in the other, and looked back toward the closed door of Walter's room. The church they had thrown him away in front of. The church with the new padlock and the red sign and the developer's name. None of them had ever owned the ground it stood on. Walter woke on the 3rd day with a tube in his arm and a stranger asleep in the chair beside his bed. Maria had not gone home. She'd folded the coat over her knees and put the page back exactly where she'd found it, because it was not hers to keep, and she had waited. When his eyes opened, she leaned forward and said her name, and then she said, "Mr. Brennan, I need to ask you about your coat." He told her he didn't have a coat anymore. He told her he didn't have anything anymore, in the flat voice of a man reporting weather. Then she unfolded the page on the blanket across his lap, and she watched his face change. He recognized the typewriter first, Eleanor's old Smith Corona, the one with the sticky lowercase e. Then the signature, then the circled words in her hand, and the date below them, 1981, and he made a sound he had not made since the day they lowered her into the ground. He pressed the soft yellow page flat with both shaking hands as if it might lift off the bed and fly away. "She told me she'd put something somewhere safe," he said, "for if things ever went bad. I thought she meant money. I looked everywhere. I never looked in the coat." He laughed once, and it broke in the middle. She sewed it into the coat. She knew I'd never throw out a good coat. That was the first step and the first goal, not to win anything, not yet just to find out what the page actually was. Walter could not do it from a hospital bed, with no money and no address. So Maria did the thing the lawyers 2 towns over had never done. She took a photograph of the page, and she started making calls. The first ally came from an unexpected direction. Maria's brother-in-law, Theo, worked the records counter at the county recorder's office, not a lawyer, not anyone important, a man who spent his days pulling dusty instruments for title companies. She sent him the photo not because she thought he could help, but because she didn't know who else to send it to. He called back 40 minutes later. His voice was strange. "Where did you get this?" He said, "Why? Because this is a recorded deed. There's a recording stamp in the corner, see the numbers? Book and page. That means the original of this is sitting in our vault. It was filed. It's real. And if it says what I think it says," he stopped. "Maria, do not lose that paper. Put it somewhere a fire can't reach it." Theo pulled the original from the vault that afternoon. The 1981 instrument was exactly what the coat had hidden a copy of, a transfer of the parcel at 14 Bell Street, the ground beneath St. Aidan's, from Eleanor Brennan, sole owner by inheritance from her father, to the diocese of the region as a gift. And typed into the body of the gift, in the careful legalese of a woman who had clearly paid a lawyer to be certain, was the condition: should the property cease to be used as a house of worship or charity, full title shall revert to the grantor, her heirs, or her estate. A reversion clause. A string tied to the gift that no one had cut in 40 years because no one had remembered it was there. Walter sat in the hospital and listened to Maria explain it, and he understood only the shape of it, not the law. But he understood one thing with total clarity. The church had stopped being a church, padlocked, condemned, pending sale. The condition had triggered. The land was no longer the diocese's to give or to sell. He had no money to chase it. So he started where he was. The hospital wanted to discharge him to the same county facility Daniel had arranged, the bed his daughter-in-law had named through the car window. Walter refused it. A social worker told him gently that a man with no home and no funds did not have many options. Walter said he had one. He asked Maria to take him to St. Aidan's. She thought he meant to sit on the steps again. Instead, he led her around the side of the building to a basement door behind the rectory, and from his pants, pocket the movers had never emptied, because he'd been wearing the pants, he took a ring of keys. 14 winters of nursing that boiler. Nobody had ever asked for the key back. The basement was dry and cold and full of the church's discarded life. Stacked folding chairs, a broken organ, boxes of hymnals, the old kitchen the parish had used for funeral lunches with a working sink and a 6-burner stove he had personally repaired in 2009. There was a cot in the corner the night custodian used to use. Walter looked at all of it and said, "I'm not trespassing. If that paper says what your brother-in-law thinks it says, this is mine." That was where he began to build. With nothing, he could not file a lawsuit, but he could clean. He swept the basement kitchen and scrubbed the stove and got the water heater going. He knew the building's bones better than any inspector. Maria brought a hot plate and a case of canned soup from her own kitchen. Word moved the way it moves in small towns. The first night, Walter fed himself and Maria. The second night, a man named Cobb, who slept under the Bell Street overpass, smelled the soup through the cracked basement window and knocked. Walter fed him too. By the end of the first week, 6 people were eating at the folding tables of a condemned church that, on paper, did not belong to anyone in particular, and on a deeper paper belonged to him. The town noticed, and the town talked. Not kindly, at first. The story that traveled was the convenient one. A confused old man, evicted by his own son for his own good, now squatting in a dangerous condemned building and dragging vagrants in off the street. A local Facebook page ran a photo of the basement window glowing at night with the caption, "Is this safe?" Someone called code enforcement. A man, Walter, had once fixed a furnace for across the street to avoid him. Then the midpoint. Daniel found out. He found out because Garrett Cole found out, and Cole was furious. The sale of 14 Bell Street was the keystone of a $4.2 million assemblage. Cole had been quietly buying the whole block, and the church lot sat in the middle of it like a missing tooth. A squatter generating sympathetic local press was a problem. A squatter claiming ownership was a catastrophe. Cole made a phone call, and 3 days later the escalation arrived in two forms. The first was a cease and desist letter, hand-delivered to the basement door from Cole's attorneys, naming Walter as a trespasser and threatening prosecution and a civil suit for interference with a pending real estate transaction. The second was quieter and crueler. Daniel filed an emergency petition for guardianship. The papers asked the court to declare Walter Brennan incapacitated, incapable of managing his own affairs, a danger to himself, residing illegally in a condemned structure, and to appoint Daniel as his legal guardian. If it succeeded, Walter would lose the right to make any decision at all. He would not be able to so much as sign his own name, and everything he might be entitled to would flow through the very man who had stolen from him. It was a brilliant move, and Walter knew it. He sat on the custodian's cot with the cease and desist in one hand and the guardianship summons in the other, and did not speak for a long time. Cobb sat across from him and finally said, "You fed me when nobody else would. What do you need?" What Walter needed was a lawyer, and lawyers cost money he did not have. This is where the second resource arrived, and where the whole shape of the fight reversed. Theo, still uneasy, still unable to stop thinking about the recorded deed, had done something on his own time. A guardianship petition is a public filing, so is a quitclaim deed. Pulling records was his entire job. He went looking for the chain of title on 14 Bell Street to understand how the diocese had ever managed to put it up for sale at all if the reversion was sitting right there in the book. And he found the lie. 3 years earlier, a quitclaim deed had been recorded. In it, the estate of Eleanor Brennan purported to release and abandon any and all reversionary interest in 14 Bell Street, clearing the way for the diocese to sell free and clear. It was signed by Daniel Brennan as attorney in fact for Walter Brennan, heir to the estate, the same power of attorney. The same forged purpose signature Daniel had collected at the kitchen table, but Theo, who handled these documents all day, saw two things the title company had missed. First, the power of attorney Daniel had used was dated 11 months ago, but the quitclaim deed was dated and recorded 3 years ago. Daniel had signed away the estate's interest using authority he would not be granted for another 2 years. The dates did not line up. The authority did not exist when the deed was signed. Second, and worse for Daniel, it did not matter even if the dates had lined up, because the reversion clause was written to the grantor, her heirs, or her estate, and the reversion had not even triggered yet 3 years ago. The church was still open then. Daniel had forged a release of a future right that wasn't his before that right even existed, to grease a sale that wouldn't happen for 2 more years. He had been planning the assemblage with Cole all along. Theo laid all of it out on the basement folding table: the 1981 recorded deed, the fraudulent quitclaim, the mismatched power of attorney, the recording stamps with their damning dates, and Maria looked at it and said the thing that made Walter finally lift his head. "This isn't about whether they can prove you're confused," she said. "It's about what they did. Walter, your son didn't just take your house. He forged a deed to land you didn't even know you owned. That's not a guardianship case. That's a felony. The cease and desist was worthless. You cannot trespass on your own property. The guardianship petition was no longer a sword. It was a confession of motive. And the $4.2 million deal at the center of the whole block was built on a recorded forgery, sitting one floor below the records vault. Walter stood up from the custodian's cot. The shaking in his hands had not gone away, and it never would. But he picked up the 1981 deed, the one Eleanor had paid a lawyer to write and sewn into a coat she knew he'd never throw away. And he held it the way a man holds the one tool that fits the one bolt nothing else will turn. Then I'm not squatting, he said. I'm home. Let them come prove I'm not. A legal aid attorney named Priya Anand took the case in a single afternoon, and she took it for free. She was not the tired young man from the office 2 towns over. She ran a small elder law clinic out of a strip mall office, and when Theo's documents came across her desk through a colleague, she drove to the basement of St. Aidan's herself to meet the client. She walked through the soup kitchen, 12 people eating now, at folding tables, under a string of work lights Walter had wired himself, and she sat down across from a 78-year-old man with shaking hands and a recorded deed from 1981, and she did not talk down to him once. She asked him to tell her about Eleanor. She listened to all of it. Then she said, "Miss Brennan, your wife was smarter than every lawyer who ever told you this was hopeless. I'd be honored to finish what she started. Priya did 3 things in 3 weeks, and each one shifted the ground. First, she answered the guardianship petition, not with a defense, but with a counterattack. She filed a motion to dismiss accompanied by a sworn declaration, a doctor's competency evaluation that found Walter fully capable of managing his own affairs, and a copy of the fraudulent quitclaim deed with the mismatched dates highlighted in yellow. Her filing did not argue that Walter was competent. It argued that the petitioner, Daniel Brennan, had a documented financial motive to have his father declared incompetent. Having already used the power of attorney to commit what the filing called, in plain black type, deed fraud against his own father. The judge read it and set the guardianship petition for a hearing and ordered Daniel to appear in person. Second, Priya recorded a document of her own, a notice of the reversion and a claim of title, filed in the same book and page system that held both the 1981 deed and the forgery, stamped and dated and public. The moment it hit the record, every title search on the entire Bell Street block returned a giant red flag. Garrett Cole's lender pulled financing on the assemblage within 48 hours. You cannot loan $4 million against a block with a clouded title and a fraud claim sitting in the chain. The deal did not collapse all at once. It started to die the way a fire dies when you cut off the air quietly, and then completely. Third, she called a reporter. The story the town had been telling confused old man, dangerous squatter did not survive contact with the facts. The new version ran on the front page of the regional paper under a photograph of Walter at the 6-burner stove he'd repaired in 2009. Ladle in hand, son accused of forging deed to sell church out from under father. The piece laid it all out: the eviction, the forged quitclaim, the reversion clause, the soup kitchen feeding a dozen people a night in the building Daniel had tried to sell. The Facebook page that had asked, "Is this safe?" went silent. A new page appeared in its place. By Friday, there were casseroles on the basement steps. By Sunday, there were volunteers. The town turned the way towns do all at once, and then insisting it had always been on his side. The man who'd crossed the street to avoid Walter showed up with a truckload of canned goods and didn't quite meet his eye. The Hendersons, whose furnace he'd fixed, organized a cleaning crew. A retired electrician helped him bring the basement up to code, so that code enforcement, when it came back, found nothing to cite. Father Reyes, the priest who joked about the plaque, drove 3 hours from his new parish to stand in the basement kitchen and weep. And then to write a letter to the diocese that no one there enjoyed receiving. And still, this is the part Priya never let Walter forget. Cole still had power. Cole had money, and money does not lose gracefully. His attorneys filed a quiet title action of their own, arguing the reversion was unenforceable, an ancient restriction on land that courts disfavor. They argued Eleanor's 1981 condition was too vague, that house of worship or charity was undefined, that the diocese had merely paused operations rather than ceased them. It was a long shot, and Cole knew it, but a long shot in court can take 2 years and cost more than an old man has, and that was the real weapon, not winning, but outlasting. Cole let it be known, through channels, that he was prepared to litigate until Walter Brennan was no longer alive to see the verdict. Walter heard the message. He understood exactly what it meant. He was 78 with shaking hands and a heart that had already stopped him once on a cold stone step. He did not flinch. He did the only thing he had ever known how to do when something was broken. He kept working. He served soup. He wired lights. He fixed the church's boiler, the real one, the big one, climbing down with a flashlight in his teeth at 78 because no one else knew how, and he got the upstairs sanctuary warm again for the first time in 6 weeks, so that on a Sunday morning, with no diocese and no priest and no permission from anyone, 20 people sat in the pews of a condemned church and shared a hot meal in the blue light from the window Eleanor had loved. The guardianship hearing was set for the second week of May, and Priya Anand drove out one last time before it, sat across from Walter at the folding table, and laid a single sheet between them. Cole's quiet title action depends on one thing, she said. It depends on the diocese never having ceased operations as a charity. On the building sitting empty and useless, proving the gift had failed. She tapped the table. Walter, for 6 weeks you have been running a charity out of this building, feeding the poor, sheltering Cobb. You haven't broken Eleanor's condition. You've been fulfilling it. You're not the squatter in his case. You're the proof that wrecks it. Walter looked around the basement, the lights, the tables, the cot in the corner where Cobb now slept warm, and for the first time since a car drove away from a church step without slowing down, something in his face settled. Then let's let everybody watch, he said. Let's do this where they can't pretend they didn't see it. The hearing on Daniel's guardianship petition was held in courtroom 3 of the county building on a Tuesday in May, and the room was full. Daniel came in a gray suit with Cole's attorney sitting 2 rows back, close enough to be useful and far enough to deny it. Daniel had expected a frightened, confused old man. He had built his entire petition on that man. What he got instead was his father in a clean pressed shirt, sitting straight at the petitioner's table beside a lawyer who had not lost emotion in 3 weeks, with a soft yellow page in a clear plastic sleeve resting on the table in front of him. Priya did not raise her voice once. She began by withdrawing nothing and conceding nothing. She handed the court the doctor's competency evaluation and asked that it be entered. She handed the court the regional newspaper. And then she handed the court 3 documents in sequence and asked the clerk to read the recording stamps aloud because the dates were the whole case, thought the 1981 deed. Eleanor Brennan to the diocese. Recorded, stamped, with the reversion clause read into the record in open court, returns to grantor, her heirs, or her estate, the quitclaim deed. The estate of Eleanor Brennan releasing that reversion. signed by Daniel Brennan, attorney in fact, recorded 3 years ago, and the power of attorney, the one that supposedly gave Daniel that authority, dated 11 months ago. Priya let the silence sit. Then she said, simply, Your Honor, my client's son signed away a property right on behalf of an estate using a power of attorney he would not be granted for another 2 years. He forged authority that did not exist to release a reversion that had not yet triggered on land his father did not know he owned, to enable a sale to a developer that has now lost its financing. He then petitioned this court to declare his father incompetent so that the only living person who could expose the forgery would no longer be permitted to speak for himself. She set down the last page. This is not a guardianship case. This man does not need a guardian. He needs the court to notice who actually committed the crime. Daniel's attorney rose to object and found there was nothing to object to. The documents were authentic. Daniel had recorded them himself. The dates were the dates. The judge looked at the quitclaim and looked at the power of attorney and looked at Daniel over the top of his glasses for a long, terrible moment. And Daniel, who had come to prove his father could not be trusted with his own name, said nothing at all, because there was nothing left to say that would not make it worse. The judge denied the guardianship petition from the bench. He found Walter Brennan fully competent. And then he did the thing Daniel had not prepared for. He ordered the entire matter, and copies of all 3 deeds, referred to the district attorney's office and to the state's elder abuse unit for investigation into deed fraud and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. It came apart all at once after that, the way Theo had said it would. The forged quitclaim was void, which meant the reversion had never been released, which meant the diocese had never owned 14 Bell Street free of Eleanor's condition, which meant that the moment the parish closed its doors, the land returned to Walter Brennan in full. Garrett Cole's $4.2 million assemblage died on the courthouse steps. With the title cloud confirmed and a felony referral attached, no lender on earth would touch it, and Cole's quiet title action built entirely on the claim that the building had sat empty and useless was gutted by 6 weeks of soup served under work lights. The man who had moved fast to demolish a church discovered he had no church to demolish and no ground to demolish it on. Daniel was charged that summer. When it was over, Walter did not stand up to make a speech. He had never been a man for speeches. He gathered the page from the table, slid it back into its sleeve, and walked out of the courtroom and the 9 blocks home to the church that was now, on paper and in fact, his. There was one more conversation, weeks later, and Walter chose it. Daniel came to the basement door out on bail, smaller than he used to look, with no laptop and no folder and no soft, patient voice. He had come, he said, to apologize. He had come. Walter understood, because there was nowhere else left to come. Walter could have rejected him. The law was finally, completely on his side, and no one in that town would have blamed an old man for closing a door on the son who had locked him out of his own life. He stood in the doorway a long time and looked at the boy he had taught to ride a bike on Sycamore Lane, the man who had sat at his kitchen table and called a forgery a hospital form. Then he stepped back and held the door open and let him in. He did not forgive him with words. Walter Brennan had never trusted words. Words were what Daniel had used to take everything. He forgave the only way he knew how. He walked his son to the 6-burner stove, and he tied an apron around him, and he handed him a ladle, and he said, "There's people coming at 6. Wash your hands." The church reopened on a Saturday in October, 18 months after a car drove away from its steps without slowing down. It was not a church anymore. Exactly. The diocese, after Father Reyes's letter and a great deal of quiet embarrassment, had signed away whatever interest it still imagined it had, and Walter had not put a cross back on the door. Above the front steps, the same stone steps, hung a plaque, small and plain, no bigger than a book, Eleanor's house. Open to anyone with nowhere to go. Inside, the sanctuary was warm. Walter had seen to that himself, down in the basement with the big boiler, flashlight in his teeth, because at 79 he still would not let anyone else touch it. The pews were full, but not with a congregation. They were full of people eating. The old funeral lunch kitchen had become a real kitchen, run 6 nights a week, and the basement cot where Cobb had once slept had multiplied into a dozen clean beds in the rooms behind the rectory. Cobb ran the front door now. He kept a list and called everyone by name. Maria came on Sundays with her brother-in-law Theo, who still could not look at a recorded deed without smiling. Priya's clinic took the overflow of old people in the county who arrived clutching documents they'd been told were hopeless, and Walter sat with each of them at a folding table and told them about a woman who had been smarter than every lawyer in the room in the corner of the main hall, against the wall. There was one cot that was always made up and never used. A small card was pinned to the blanket with a name on it, Walter Brennan. Not a memorial, he was very much alive, and would tell you so. A reminder. The bed they keep for the man who once had nowhere to sleep, so that no one who walks through the door ever forgets it can happen to anyone. Daniel washed dishes on Tuesdays and Thursdays, the terms of his sentence and his welcome both. He and his father did not talk much. They did not need to. They worked the same kitchen on opposite ends of the same long sink, and that was its own kind of language. On the windowsill in the new kitchen, where the morning light came in, Walter had set 2 things. Eleanor's reading glasses, folded exactly as she'd left them, and the brass Mantel clock recovered at last from a storage unit, the only thing he'd asked for back. It still lost 4 minutes a week. He had given up correcting that long ago. Every morning at 6, before the doors opened and the first people came in from the cold, Walter Brennan put the kettle on. And while it heated, he reached up and wound the clock 3 half turns, the way he always had, and stood in the blue light from Eleanor's window and listened for the tick to catch. It always did.